And welcome to tonight's talk on the fascinating topic of AI, ChatGPT, consciousness, writing, and God. Okay, I'll read the rest. In recent years, the advancement in artificial intelligence and the creation of large language models like ChatGPT have opened up new possibilities in the field of writing, leading us to question the nature of consciousness and its role in the writing process. Additionally, the seemingly conscious-like behavior displayed by these systems has sparked debates about the existence of God and the relationship between AI and spirituality. And then it goes on. So when you give a talk on ChatGPT, everyone does this. The first paragraph is something that ChatGPT generated. So that whole paragraph was a ChatGPT-generated paragraph. When I asked it, give me the first paragraph on a talk with this title. It was much more funny when I gave it at TGIF, because it was at 7 o'clock in the morning. And so when I started with good evening and welcome to tonight's talk, people laughed more. But it's amazing, right, what this system can do, that it can generate things like this. I think most of you by now know what ChatGPT is, but if you don't, it's a dialogue system. You can log on to OpenAI's website. It's a company in San Francisco, and you can converse with this agent. You can ask it questions. You can ask it to write paragraphs for you or to rewrite things if it's not written well. And I think I think especially for people that use writing as the primary way to express themselves, it's raised a lot of questions and issues. So it misses context sometimes, like when I asked it to write the first paragraph, it didn't know whether it would be in the morning or the evening, so it just started with good evening. But otherwise, it's very impressive, right? So the follow-up question when I said, this is my talk, give the right paragraph. The next question I asked is, please rewrite that paragraph, but in the style of Dracula, okay? So this is Bram Stoker's very entertaining novel, if you like kind of late 1800s science fiction. And this is what it then responds with, and you don't have to read the whole thing, but it's amazing. Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to this dark and intriguing discussion on the blah, 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 blah. And then later on, it has unleashed new horrors. So it uses like these, this evening we shall delve into the dark and intertwined issues, using words like unearthing and mysterious relationships. So it's really impressive what this system can do. So my goals of this talk, I basically have three goals. The first is people are freaking out, and my first goal is to demystify it a little bit, to just tell you at a fundamental level, how is this thing built? How does it work? And how did they get to this amazing capabilities? So to demystify it a bit, it's very boring, that part of the talk, because it's like a first-year lecture. But what I want you to take away is that you have the ability to make your own judgment about what this thing actually is and the impact that it will have. My second sub point is that I want you to see that we shouldn't make more of this model than what it is. Okay, so if you read The Guardian or Daily Maverick or something like that, I'm not sure they all had articles about this, but you might walk away from that thinking that this thing is sentient and it's alive and conscious and so on. And I think we shouldn't make more of this model than what it is. We also shouldn't have the opposite kind of bias, which is where I come from, where we make less of it than what it is. So when Stella asked me to give the talk, I'm like, ugh, one more talk. And then I started using this thing for 2 days. Okay, so that's cost that I'll put on her bill. But, and then I was like, oh, fudge. Okay, this is actually quite crazy. So it's not as much as The Guardian makes it to be, but it's not as little as some academics makes it to be. And then the third part, which is just a little bit more of a personal reflection, how actually many of the discussions I've had with students about ChatGPT have led to much deeper discussions with them than I've ever had in my life with any of my students. And so I think I want to share some of those personal reflections with you. So the talk will be very boring. You saw the abstract. I won't answer these big questions. But of course, then at some point I will start rambling and give my own opinions about stuff. And it will grow progressively more opinionated towards the end. So hopefully the power goes off and then I will just stop. So the first boring part of the talk is a first year introduction to machine learning. Okay, machine learning is this subfield of artificial intelligence. Okay, I like machine learning a little bit more because it's slightly more concrete. And for a second, I want you to forget about ChatGPT. Some of you have used it. Just forget about it, just for 1 second. And I'm just going to explain the basics of machine learning, how AI systems are built. Supervised machine learning systems. And across the board, if you use speech recognition on your phone, Google Translate, any of these systems are built following these same principles. Forget about ChatGPT. For a second, we're going to look at the different task called image captioning. Okay? Now, in image captioning, the goal is I want a program where I can give it a picture as input, and I want that program to kick out a caption, a written sentence telling me what happens in the picture. Okay, that's the aim of the game. Now, in the early parts of artificial intelligence, how people tried to do this, that middle block there, they tried to code that up by hand, right? So you would write a little program with a bunch of if and complicated statements, and you would basically have a bunch of rules to try and go from pixels to a sentence. Very complicated. So instead, what people then realized was to follow the machine learning route. And in the machine learning route, instead of explicitly programming in the steps into your program, you define a loose structure. I use that's a little neural network there. You define a loose structure, but with a bunch of numbers in it, okay, which we call parameters. But instead of explicitly setting those numbers by hand, you let some algorithm wiggle those numbers around until you get the desired output. Okay, so to just summarize that, what we will do instead of explicitly writing out the code to go from image to text, what we will do is we will give a model a ton of examples of images with the corresponding output. And then by learning from millions and millions of examples, we let the algorithm wiggle the parameters, the numbers inside of the function, wiggle it until we get the type of output that we see in the examples that we've given it. Does that make sense? Okay. So this might be one of my training images. So I give it this image and I tell it, wiggle the numbers around until you get that output or something close to it. I might give it another image, maybe this one, a dog in the air chasing his friend. Okay, that's the caption. So some human wrote down that caption with that image. And I'm now telling the model, take that image, produce this human caption. Okay, give it another example, a man riding a horse. Okay, and a last one, a dog jumping over a fence. And we give it literally millions of examples. Okay, so humans went and annotated these figures, these images, and we give it millions of examples. We've got a learning algorithm that wiggles the parameters to get the output for the examples that we give it. Okay, people are falling asleep. That's excellent because this is really boring, but this is the basics of machine learning. It should be a little bit boring. Now we've got our model. It's built, and now we go into the world, and then what we do is we give it another image. It wasn't seen during training. It's not something that we gave it to wiggle its parameters. It's a new image that it hasn't seen. Okay, so maybe this is the image that we give it. Now it's seen millions and millions of examples, and from that it set its numbers, and now you give it an image like that, and then it might produce a right caption like a dog is jumping over a fence. Okay. The one principle I want you to take away here is there's two kind of phases to machine learning. The one is training time, where you give it a ton of examples from humans, and then test time or inference time, where you actually give it something that it hasn't seen before, and you ask, give me some output. So most of the time when we use ChatGPT, it's at test time, it's inference time. It's seeing things that it probably hasn't seen during training. Okay.
Is the parameters visible? I mean, are the parameters once it's wiggled around in a black box, or is it visible? Can you actually analyze what it did with the parameters?
This is a very good question. It's very hard to analyze these neural networks, but there's a whole sub-community in machine learning. So if you go to these conferences, there would be interpretability sessions, basically just people writing papers on how you actually figure out what is going on inside. It's pretty difficult. And I'll say something about the size of ChatGPT. That makes it even more difficult. But you can to some extent, so to be concrete here, we've got approaches which allows you to say, okay, you've made that prediction. Tell me in the image, what did you look at to make that word dog there? To give the output dog there. What was the thing inside the image that you looked at when you made that prediction? And then you can reverse engineer through the very big models. But it's to a large extent a black box. Okay, so
just type in ChatGPT, what did you do to, and then it spits out the answer.
yeah, so if you understand how ChatGPT is built, which I'll explain in a second, it will give you an answer.
There's an interesting example where someone asked it for its first 10 weights and it gave it 10 weights, but it could be that it just inferred those 10 weights. So
yeah, it's not trained on its weights. So ChatGPT, let me just think about this. I don't think ChatGPT would be able to answer that question.
It did come up with an answer.
So when I say number, parameter, the thing that you wiggle, the number inside the function, it's literally a number, like -5, okay? And basically, it's something inside the function, and while you're training it inside that model, while you're training it, basically it would say, oh, change this number, instead of -5, put a -6 here, because then I'm going to do better on the training example. You're going to get closer to your output. So I use parameter and number and weight kind of interchangeably. And when I say wiggle, I mean gradient descent, if you know what that is, okay, but wiggle. Okay, yeah, so the first principle I want you to just get is training and test time, okay, and that's important. The second one I want to talk about is generalization. So let's say I give it another image, this image. Okay, now if you paid attention, here I've got a cat on top of a dog. But let's say just for the moment that this model has never seen, during training, a cat on top of a dog. It's never seen this. It's a novel example. It hasn't seen a picture like this before. But it has seen cats, it has seen dogs, and it has seen maybe people riding on stuff. Then this model, and this has been shown, has the capability of outputting a caption like this. A cute cat riding on top of a dog. Okay? It's seen this principal riding, it's seen this principal cat, dog. Even though it's never seen this combination, it's able to generalize. So that's the second concept I want you to get across, generalization. So when we're going to talk about ChatGPT, even though it's never seen the combination of two things, it can actually produce the output or generalize to things that it hasn't seen before. So these models don't just memorize, they can actually generalize to things that it hasn't seen before, which is truly impressive, right? This was, I think, something that neural networks, when this came along in the 2010s, really solved, and we saw massive capabilities with these things. Okay, you all now know what machine learning is, so okay, what the fudge is ChatGPT? To understand ChatGPT, you need to understand GPT. GPT is basically the thing on which ChatGPT is built. So you can think of that as the underlying model. It stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, which I had to look up.
Okay, yeah, we just call it ChatGPT.
Yeah.
ChatGPT. Yeah, I keep on saying PGT. I don't know why, but okay. So what is GPT? You now understand machine learning. Machine learning, inputs, outputs, training, test time, generalization. Done. Okay, cool. I don't know why I teach a whole course on that. Okay. So GPT is a large language model. That's the kind of family of machine learning models. And these are models that takes in text and produces text. So it takes in a bit of text and it produces text. And GPT, specifically, actually the output is a single word. It's always a single word that it produces on the output side. So what is it trained on? It's trained basically on scraped data from the internet. So they went and they scraped a humongous corpus, which includes the whole of Wikipedia and a number of other sources. So it's trained on a humongous body of text. And what is it trained to do? So let's say I scraped Wikipedia and I got to the Star Wars Wikipedia page, and this was the text was scraped. What the model is trained, we're in training time, I'm giving its examples. It's basically trained to predict the next word. Okay, so if that top part there is my article, the Star Wars franchise depicts blah, 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 then what I could do is, okay, I could say the star, what you need to do is, I give you the first two words of the sentence, predict the next word. Wiggle your weights, parameters, numbers, gradient descent. Wiggle your weights so that you predict wars if you see the first two words, the star, okay? Then you train it. Okay, now I give you the Star Wars. I train you to predict the next word. Okay, and Wikipedia says the next word is franchise. Okay, cool. We predicted. We wiggle the parameters so that we get the word franchise out. Okay, does that make sense? Pretty earth-shattering. This is the fundamental technology. Okay, so that's
based on Wikipedia. That's desperate.
well, it's not just Wikipedia. Like massive amounts of text. I think it's I mean, in my lectures when I just say things off the hand, and I say it's trained on the internet, right?
Yeah.
And that's what allowed GPT to be so powerful, because you have, like, the whole of humanity went and put all their English text in one place, right? Okay, and now OpenAI is using that. Okay, so that's training time. Now you guys know that GPT doesn't, when you use it, it doesn't just predict one word, right? It gives us a whole sentence. So what happens at test time, at inference time? What happens there that it's able to generate a whole string of words for me? So we're now in test time. I'm now giving it input. It hasn't seen this input before, and I'm going to run GPT. Remember, GPT is not ChatGPT. GPT is like the underlying building block. It's a language model. Can only predict one word at a time. Okay. So inference time, we're at test time. It's never seen the following sentence. It's never seen the sentence. Here is an example of how to write in the style of Dracula, : greetings. Okay. That's what I give it. That's the input. I ask it, predict the next word. That's what I do. I ask it, predict the next word. So I don't know if this is a cartoon example, but let's say it predicts the word my. Okay. Now what they do is something very clever. I want this thing to generate more than one word. So what I do is I take its own output and I feed it back as the input to the model. And I ask it, now your input is, here's an example of how to write in the style of Dracula, : greetings, my, what's the next word? Okay, friends, or dear, sorry. Friends. And in this way, you have this like basically feeding back its output, and in this way it can generate a whole sentence for you if you start it out with the right prompt. Okay, does this make sense? Yeah. Pretty cool. Okay, so GPT. Now we get to some of the questions. So this is GPT, still underlying building block, and I'll tell you in one line, one bullet, what ChatGPT is. So GPT is what's made it different. So this idea of language modeling, large language modeling, have been around since the early 90s, probably earlier. This idea of basically predicting the next word. Okay, but what made GPT unique at the time was the scale at which they did this. It was massive, and still is. So the number of parameters, weights, numbers, the things I can wiggle, is 175 billion parameters. So I think there are rough estimates for the number of stars in the stars are 200 billion, big error margins there, but it's a humongous model. The biggest model before this was a tenth the size. Okay, so it was a massive step up because they had the resources of Microsoft. It's trained on data crawled from the internet, roughly 500 billion tokens. And to just give you an idea, a 10-year-old child, also the variance on this is very high, but the 10-year-old child, something like 100 million words that they hear by the age of 10. So this means that this model sees more data than any human being will be able to read or consume or hear in their lifetime. Okay. I always struggle to understand what that B means or whatever, so I just put the zeros there, and that I think just like underlines how big this thing is. So it's very big. Yes.
Sorry, what's a token exactly? Is that one input?
Okay.
A word, or is it like a data, like a packet?
It's I want to say you can think of it as a word. It's not exactly a word. It's so that's why I write tokens and not words. You can think of it as words, but it is what it really is a subword. Okay. So it's a little piece. The input gets broken up into BPE tokens. You can go and look it up a bit. It's little subword stuff. So if you have a very long word, I don't know, preconceive, then the input might be pre-conceive, to give you an idea. So it's difficult to compare these things directly. So GPT is at the bottom, this massive thing. What is ChatGPT? Now you understand large language models are these things that produce one word at a time. But when you're using ChatGPT, it doesn't feel like that, right? You're actually having a dialogue with it. So what they did was they used a technique called reinforcement learning, where with a little bit of interaction with humans, they basically updated the model in order to look more like something that you would have a conversation with. So you had a little human-in-the-loop reinforcement learning kind of step right after. It's relatively small compared to the rest of the model. Does that make sense? I should say, since I gave this talk, GPT-4 has been launched, which is even bigger. They're not. I don't know if they disclosed all the information, but it's even bigger. So I'll say something about that as well. Okay. So what can ChatGPT do? I've shown you some examples. You've maybe used it. It's very clear that it can write fluent sentences in English. Okay. And that's already a massive thing. It's quite a skill, and if you're in a university and your primary way to assess your students are whether they can write fluently, then it's kind of concerning. It can combine existing ideas and then write this out fluently. So this gets to the generalization, right? Where I say, even though it's never seen two things in a specific combination, it can actually generalize and produce output which combines the different parts of what it's seen. So it's able to generalize. And so one example of this, when I gave the previous talk, I wanted to sound really clever. I've now given up on that. But I wanted to sound like a philosopher. So I asked ChatGPT can you come up with a philosophy of science that sounds really clever, that combines that of Keane and Popper, okay, who I know because I read some Wikipedia. And Keane and Popper are these like philosophers of science. And I asked ChatGPT, okay, well, you can generalize, right? So come up with a philosophy that combines these two philosophers who are actually pitted against each other, for their philosophies. And then it gives a very convincing answer. So it starts by saying, then that second paragraph basically says, Keane is all about paradigms and so on, which is absolutely true. Popper is all about falsifiability, absolutely true. And then in the last paragraph, it says, well, a combined philosophy will basically combine things with paradigms and then things with critical testing of theories, which is a very convincing argument. Maybe not super creative, but I think it's still impressive. So if you are giving a philosophy course and one of your essay questions are, can you come up with a idea of combining the two, then ChatGPT will be able to answer that question. I mean, it's maybe not in a super creative way. I mean, if you were a philosopher and your business is to combine Keane and Popper, then you're kind of screwed, right? But maybe that wasn't a good endeavor to start with. Okay, another example, and this is a very simple example that really freaked me out, because I think this is really where it showed that it can generalize. So this is a very simple it's not a simple math question, but it is a math question that you can do on a calculator. So I ask it, what's the square root of 1,072,003? And almost with 100% certainty, it's never seen text on the internet asking this specific question. So it's never seen this specific question. And it says the square root of, okay, and cool, it converted that to a number. I mean, Jacob Zuma can't do that, but okay. And then it says is equal to 1032, okay? I mean, in his defense, I will also struggle to read that, but okay. The square root of that is equal to 1032. This is amazing, right, that it can do that. The answer is wrong. It's 1035 point something, something, something. But what this means is, this is profound, right? So it's just trying to predict the next word. That's all it's seen. It's seen the internet, but somewhere inside the weights, somewhere inside this very big model, there's a little subroutine or a little set of weights that has learned to approximate the square root of a number, right? Because it's never seen this specific number. It couldn't have memorized 1 million, blah blah blah. Couldn't have memorized that. So there's little subroutines inside it that it can do. There are limitations to this. So people have given it like math Olympiad questions and physics questions and so on. And there's a range of things. People are like, oh, it makes really dumb mistakes. But the questions are sometimes really hard. So people in natural language processing and people from physics and maths have been trying out and seeing what the limits are of this thing. And so if the numbers get very large with math stuff, then it starts to break down. So it's not an exact subroutine like you have on a calculator, which is like really good. But so there are limitations to this. But it can.
Version 4 has Wolfram as a plugin now.
Yeah, so it's very interesting what people are doing. So they're doing this type of thing where you're saying, oh, remember you need to give it a prompt. That red thing that I wrote was the question that I wrote. And so what people are doing now is they're becoming very clever with the prompts, or OpenAI can integrate Wolfram inside the model and actually have a like explicit mathematics like subroutine somewhere inside. Or the model can have access to that other model and then access it. So I saw examples today of basically where you write out, hey ChatGPT, I'm going to ask you a bunch of math questions, but if you really struggle to answer it, here is another platform that you can use in order to answer the question. So and then of course it can do like very, very powerful things. Okay, so that's what it can do. This was also, I wrote this a month ago or so. So I think it's been expanded, like the number of things. The stuff that amazes me is that it can generate figures. So you can ask it, draw ASCII art of a cat. I actually did that. And because it can only generate characters, but with characters it can draw a little cat. Or, you don't want to know this, but some engineers use TTIC, which is a programming language with which you draw figures. And what all the students now are doing is instead of coding up the code to draw the figure, they tell it, please draw me a bar graph with arrow here and a bar graph here and the mathematical symbol here, and give me the code. Enter, and the code comes out and it works. Okay. Because it's been trained on the whole of Stack Overflow, right, which is this repository of programming questions, it's actually seen a ton of these things. Okay. So what can it not do, or what is the limitations of ChatGPT? Okay, and I will say up front that when I gave this talk, I said that I think many of these limitations will be lifted. Okay, and some of them have been lifted since I gave the talk, the first talk. So limitations of ChatGPT, and this still holds, is that there's no online learning. So it's trained on a massive amount of text, but then as new text arrives on the internet, it's not actually updated on that text. It's only trained up until, data for up until 2021. I'm not sure about GPT-4, but GPT-4 I also know is only trained up to a certain point, and it's not updated as you go along. Okay, this is a limitation that will probably be lifted. It's dangerous when you start to do online learning because so a few years ago, Microsoft did this online learning thing where they had a chatbot on Twitter, and because it was learned online, people were basically making a very, very bad non-PC joke about this and training it to be racist very quickly. So I think, yeah.
They are doing new models, but it won't necessarily be in ChatGPT. It'll be an iteration of 3.5 with a date. Yeah, exactly. So there are more models getting released, but it's not learning on the fly. Another limitation, I put that in quotes, is that safeguards have been added since the first release. So my students, when it was released, they immediately jumped on this and they went crazy, right? And they say since that first release, the model has actually gotten, I'll put it in their words, worse, because more and more safeguards have been added to basically limit what it can do, because it was hallucinating false things, right? So because it's just kicking out sensible words, it would actually sometimes say things that's factually untrue, and you had no way to deal with that. So they manually started adding safeguards, and this is, I think, an open area of research. They need to figure out how to sensibly put in safeguards. There's more safeguards in GPT-4 because they had what they call red teamers, so security people try and break out of the model.
Yeah.
So they have to do, like there was something called, I think, Dan. If you put Dan in your prompt, it would break all the protections they put in.
Yeah.
So they've added a lot more, which is where a lot of the ethical stuff really comes in.
Yeah, so my students told me that on Reddit, they were just like this active thing where people was saying like, oh, it's been safeguarded, or my students called it shackled. To unshackle it, put this in your prompt, and then you will have access to the original model. And then OpenAI would add a safeguard for that thing, and it was basically this little arms race of just, hacking it and getting it out. So that's a limitation, but I guess it's good that there are these safeguards. You don't want, if you ask it to make a bomb with like fertilizer and stuff, there are stuff that you don't don't want. Okay, scale. So very often when I log on now, it says there's too many users, you can't use it. Scale is also a solvable problem, I think. Limited memory. So this is an interesting thing. It can you can give it a very long text, but it's actually limited because of the model what it can look at. So it can only look at a certain number of inputs. So ChatGPT, I think they're fairly certain it was 2048 tokens that it could read in. If you gave it stuff before that, it couldn't actually look at that when it produced its next output. And I said that this would be lifted, and GPT-4, it's unsure, but it's clear that it's much more tokens. So to just illustrate this one limitation, for instance, you can't ask it a question like, please output, chat to me for 3 hours and then output something, because it won't be able to remember. If you then add 2048 tokens after that, then it won't actually remember that first thing. So it doesn't have memory. I mean, my student came up with this, and then I just tried it. So I said, please output 5 exclamation marks, but only in 15 minutes time. It said, I'm sorry, I cannot wait for 15 minutes to output the requested text. Here are the 5 exclamation marks you asked for. And okay, so it's not.
There are only 4. We cannot count.
Yeah, so, I mean, because it's a language model, right? That's what it is in the end. Let me just take a sip. Okay, so limitations, like I said, I think many of these limitations, if it's not ChatGPT, I'm talking in general here, there will be more powerful models from different companies coming out, and I think it will have a massive effect on us, but, and these specific limitations, I think, will actually be lifted. They're engineering challenges and solvable with technology in the next, well, apparently much quicker than I thought. Okay, so how will it affect us? I think it will have a huge effect on how we write, especially if OpenAI and Microsoft can sort out the scale and get it to a state where Grammarly is. So many of you might use Grammarly. I think you should remember Grammarly actually took a really long time after very good spell checkers and grammar checkers to make it super accessible. And maybe this will be much faster now, but I think if OpenAI and Microsoft or one of the competitors can get their version, scale, I think will have a massive effect on how we write. In some fields, we will have to rethink how we assess our students, especially if I'm not in the humanities, but my wife did a master's in political science. And I know, though, like for instance, take-home assessments where you have three days to write something, you will have to set your questions very carefully if you're going to keep those models. But I think there were issues with that way of assessment anyway, right? In principle, you could have paid someone to write that for you. So I think assessments, I've got very deep thoughts about assessments, but I won't put this in the recording. So you can ask me about that.
Maybe I'll just add that we haven't had in-person tests in the humanities for quite some years now. And my students, 200 students, are writing an in-person test tomorrow by hand, and they're hysterical.
It's an easy fix, right?
That's cool.
Easy fix, right? Oral examinations doesn't scale, and that's a problem. But oral examinations. So I do think it will address the low-hanging and easy problems that we have, even if those were considered creative in the past. So if you're a philosopher whose sole game is to combine Kuhn and Popper, you're okay, you will have problems. And then last week I read this, and I think this is just an interesting perspective. It was a MIT Tech Review article where this guy interviewed a bunch of people, and this guy, who's an economist, he said that it's important to maybe, so in the machine learning AI community, there's a lot of push to build things that can replace humans or do things as good as humans. And it was interesting, he said that's maybe a wrong direction to go, and you should really ask, what does this allow humans to do that we couldn't do in the past? So new tasks and extend our capabilities rather than asking who can I replace. So I think this is a decision that we maybe as humanity need to make, whether we want to replace people or basically ask how can we enhance stuff. Okay, How it will not affect us, I don't think just like in the immediate future it will take your job, except if you are the keen pauper philosopher, okay, then. I don't think it will replace creative and critical thinking, philosophy, mathematical proofs. There's sometimes a little spark that you need in the last part of a mathematical proof that's not on the internet and not so easy for just combining two ideas. Now, I should like emphasize here, I'm also one of the people that think that there isn't really such a thing as a really, really new idea. And the science is just a very messy process. And that most of the time we're just combining new ideas. And of course, ChatGPT can combine, it can generalize. There are limits to how far it can go outside of its training distribution. An image captioning system can't caption an image of the Death Star if it's never ever seen Star Wars, right? So there are limitations. But yeah, I guess the question is like how far can we use it to just combine? If you're just combining ideas, then ChatGPT is really good. And that's why I make that last point where I think it could change the way that we come up with ideas. So I tried to use it to answer some of my own research questions. And I had a little discussion like, how would you, so I work in speech processing, and I was like, how would you build an unsupervised speech processing system? And it came up with very obvious answers. Like stuff, we all know that that's the answer, but it's not so easy. But then if you keep on a dialogue with it, it might bring up papers or stuff that you haven't read, or use other words that you haven't used before. And then you're like, okay, well, this is an interesting idea. Remember, it has no idea of an idea, right? It can't actually interpret itself. So they still need to be a human that says, oh, this is a sensible research direction. Okay. Now I'm getting into the slightly more opinionated, like less concrete, factual stuff. So if you want to stop believing what I'm saying now is the time. Most of what I said now is, I think, true, and now I'm not so sure. So what ChatGPT is not, it's not conscious. So this is really interesting. I asked a bunch of colleagues in AI and machine learning and a bunch of students, just is ChatGPT conscious? Okay, and then they would be like, I'm like, is it conscious? Is it conscious? And inevitably they would say no. No one said yes. Okay, but the interesting thing is it's always no, full stop, but, and then something else follows, right? Something like, there's not a good definition of consciousness. No, it's not conscious, but it's impossible for science to prove consciousness. No, but how do I know you're conscious, right? No, it's a valid, I'll talk about this. No, but there's no such thing as consciousness, right? And I think that's where some of the super interesting questions came out with my students, chatting to them about like the questions that I will continue to talk about now. It doesn't have intention. You need a prompt for it to do something, okay? And it doesn't have free will. Again, chatting to my students, I was amazed that at the number of students who take this very brave stance that there isn't such a thing as free will. And we can also talk about that, maybe not too much, okay? I'm not sure like whether there is consciousness, whether there is intention, and whether there is free will. Okay, we can debate that, but ChatGPT doesn't have any of those, okay? I mean, the one thing you can do is you can just ask it, are you conscious? And it says, no, I'm not conscious, okay? It might lie.
Yeah.
But
sounds like something conscious
Sounds
would
like a
say.
conscious answer.
no, I'm not conscious. This is maybe one of the pre-prompt shackled things that they put in. I'm fairly sure, because this phrase, I'm an artificial intelligence program created by OpenAI, this pops up for many of the questions that you ask it. So, yeah. So it won't make, it doesn't have intention. So if people say like, you know, these things will become sentient and then, you know, we ask it to solve global warming and then it wipes out humanity because that's one solution to global warming, which is true, right? It doesn't have intention. It can't do these things on its own. Okay, you need a prompt for it. Okay.
Can it select randomly?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So if you ask it the same thing twice, does it give the same answer? No, there's a bit of randomness in the generation process. So I didn't go into all the detail. But when you're asking it, give me the next word, it actually doesn't just give you the most likely next word. So how these models are built, it will say, oh, the probability of this word is this, 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 and this.
Right.
And instead of just taking the most probable word, you normally sample from that. This is a bit technical, but it makes sense, right? So you might sometimes output the second most likely word, and you need to do that to get human-like outputs from the model. Otherwise, it looks very artificial.
But it's programmed to sometimes choose the second one and programmed to sometimes choose the fourth one. It doesn't do it automatically. It doesn't select randomly itself. It's programmed.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes. So
somebody
you roll the 50,000-sided dice, and the dice is weighed according to the probability of the next word, and the thing that comes out is the one it's oversimplified, but that's explicitly chosen. You could just say, just pick the best word.
Yeah.
And then if they did that in the program, then it will always give the same output, but it doesn't.
Do that.
Now, the randomness isn't massive. I've tried to play around with it, but there is a little bit of randomness.
Right.
So
that's a measure for free will. Free will is I can choose this and I can choose that and I can choose that, and I do it randomly.
Yeah.
But a computer program is always something that's the randomness is programmed. Like first choose the first option and then choose the fourth option, and then it simulates randomness, but it's not truly random.
It's pretty close to truly random.
Okay.
So the thing is, it depends on what, like the definition of free will and intention, right? There's definitely not intention there. But in talking to people, and I should emphasize this is not my area of expertise, they would say that, listen, let's say humans don't have free will, right? There is also randomness, let me put it differently. There is also a randomness in the neurochemical processes in the brain, right? At least at the subatomic levels, there are random things that happen there. So you can ask, like, is that free will rolling a dice there? And that's very different from saying there's intention, right? But it's a good is the free will in ChatGPT? Well, you could maybe say it has. It definitely doesn't have intention. I hope I rambled enough there. Yeah. I'll ramble more now. So I think I'm going to basically summarize making a big jump here basically to struggles that I had with Christianity, and then I'll bring it back to the ChatGPT discussion. And many of these struggles, the things that I struggled with, also it came out for the first time that I was able to talk to students about it, was leading from these discussions about ChatGPT. So the big jump there, consciousness and the existence of God, okay, from ChatGPT. So this is I guess very personal. My wife always says I'm too apologetic about trying to say I'm so sorry, but okay, so I'll just ramble. So I think I grew up in a Christian household. I went to a church when I was young, and in my university years, I at some point I realized I'm really struggling with Christianity. But the core issue for me, the most difficult thing that I struggled with, was the existence of God, right? It's like the real starting point, and a lot of the stuff I read at that time actually assumed that you were at least a theist, and then from there on. And I found many of those arguments quite compelling for Christianity specifically, but I struggled with the starting point, the existence of God. So even now, today, people in my Bible study would know I'm quite sympathetic to atheism because I struggled with that real starting point. So in my university years, I was like, "What's your struggles with Christianity?" And I figured out that was the main crux for me. And at some point, I remember one night, because this picture of this massive deity was it's so amazing. I mean, it's like earth-shattering, and I really struggled with that. And then I remember one night where I'm like, oh, I think I'm actually an atheist. Because for me, it was a decision between two things. Atheism, which would then mean there's no God, obviously, but that the world is then basically has always existed, a universe that's, well, since the Big Bang, okay, but the laws of physics is basically what determines what happens to us, and basically everything around us is determined by physics. So it's a very oversimplified view of naturalism or materialism. And I was like, this is the one option, okay? And then the other option is there is a God. It is the God of Christianity. And then it means that there is something outside of materialism, outside of just the pure physics, okay? Now, in my university years, I struggled with the idea of God. Okay, I really struggled with this. Then I was like, I think I'm an atheist, okay? I'm not telling my dad, he'd be deeply disappointed in me, and I've always gone to church. So I'm not telling anyone, but I think I'm an atheist. And I struggled with that as well, okay? Because now materialism is all that there is. And I remember one night where I'm like, this can't be true. And the crux, the crucial thing that really broke it for me was the fact that I am, right? That I'm conscious. That I'm a thinking being. I mean, that's a very I have a mind, okay? And that was something that pure materialism, naturalism, couldn't actually answer for me. And then a bunch of stuff clicked in, and I was like, I need to reject this, right? I cannot hold to this. And so, I mean, after that, there's a bunch of other reasons also for the existence of God, but that's really where I think consciousness, the fact that we have a mind, is to me massively compelling. It's like there were two options, and Sherlock Holmes always says, like, if you eliminate all the options, the one that remains, even if you think it's improbable, is the truth, right? And it was kind of, I think that for me, it was reluctant, right? How does C.S. Lewis being dragged into this, but it's kind of like that. Now I thought all of this was super novel, and then like it was really profound. And then so a few years ago I started writing it out for myself, just to like have it for myself. And then I went to the source of all knowledge, which is Wikipedia, and I found out that other people have had the same ideas for many years. Descartes, or as I call him, Descartes, on a personal level, he already had these things. Okay, so let me just bring that back. I think I've got a few minutes before, but the rest I can really just ramble on. Just bring it back to ChatGPT and how I link that with discussions and kind of apply it to this. And I should say I'm not a philosopher of mind, right? I'm not trained in this, and it's always very dangerous if you ask an engineer to give an opinion on anything, because they will. And I'm not. This is not. This is not my area of expertise. But if I had to apply to this discussion of ChatGPT, I think there's this question, right? This thing implemented on silicon hardware, are according to almost all experts not conscious, okay? I am also implemented on hardware. It's neurochemical hardware here. It is hardware, right? There's processes going on here. But I am conscious. It's difficult to prove this to you, but I am. So I know that in quotes there, I am more than the result of the physical biological system. I'm not just acting out a deterministic process governed by my implementation. So this, and of course this is a belief, right? I cannot prove this to you. I believe it absolutely. And I guess that's where the knocking of heads between science and philosophy comes in. If this is true, if you get to the point where you're like, oh, there's something here that materialism cannot explain, right? Then that's a quite profound point, because then that means you cannot hold to this idea that I am more than my physical implementation and still be a naturalist. So how I put that on the slide originally was I said I believe that there is You cannot hold to the above, that there's something more, and believe that there is only a physical realm. Okay, and after the talk at TGIF, I'll say something about this. People are like, oh, you should maybe rephrase that. But my main point here is to say that you cannot, like, consciousness and the mind, it poses a massive problem for materialism. And so I think that's, how it came out. So I went to Wikipedia, Descartes, he did already proposed some of this stuff. There's excellent Wikipedia articles on the existence of God, like really, really good Wikipedia articles on the existence of God. And then specifically the argument from consciousness, which this guy, Richard Swinburne, who looks like really believable, he's at Oxford like this, he's got a tie and everything. He says mental states are genuine, non-physical mental entities that exist. Okay? I actually don't agree with that quote, but it's a really nice quote. Okay. So I don't fully agree with it, but I think it captures something of what I'm trying to say. Okay. Everyone happy with ish where I'm at? So there's 4 slides left, but they're very small. What I wanted to quickly do, because you gave me more time, was to quickly talk about stuff that people said to me after the TGIF talk, or feedback that people gave me and asked questions, and just give like very quick feedback on that. So the first thing was the sentence I had: you cannot hold to the above and believe that there is only a physical realm. Okay? And so I made the claim there needs to be a spiritual realm as well. And then so someone asked me, oh, you're a dualist. Okay? And this was over WhatsApp, so this was nice because I'm like, cool, I have no idea what a dualist is. So Wikipedia, and I go and read Wikipedia. And so Descartes is apparent. People in philosophy of mind apparently don't like him too much because he was a dualist, which basically means that there's a separation between the physical realm and the spiritual realm, and in some way they interact. It makes it very complicated because you need, as a philosopher of mind, then to explain how does the physical and the spiritual interact. The contrast to this is monoism, which is the position that mind and body are ontologically indiscernible entities, not dependent substances. This is from Wikipedia, so I had to go and look up what ontologically means. Okay, and I figured that out as well. Okay, but basically monoism is basically the physical, and very simplified, the physical and the conscious or the mind realms are actually more tightly integrated. I'm not sure what I am. And I don't think it matters too much, okay? But that was one. I don't know if it was a criticism. The other thing that I think is a little bit more important was that in the talk, Toby Lowe asked me, listen, you've got this quote from Richard Swinburne on there, mental states are genuinely non-physical mental entities that exist. And he said, aren't you getting to a God of the gaps type of argument here? Where, over millennia, there's been this case where science can't answer specific things. Even Newton did this, right? And then would attribute the things that science can't answer at the moment. You would say, oh, God is kind of actively fixing that as we're going on. And my answer in the talk, and I think I still hold by this, it's not a very satisfying answer, was that I think of consciousness much more. It's a much more basic thing. Than mental states. It's a much more profound thing. So Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? It's quite profound, and that I am, I think it gets to the crux of it. When God reveals himself in Exodus, it's the God of I am. So it's more like, I think, therefore I am created in the image of God, right? It's more closely coupled to that. Not a satisfying answer, but that's the one I gave. But it is a more fundamental thing than just the God of the gaps, specifically because I dabble a little bit in my work with cognitive science. So I work in engineering, but some of my research intersects with it's on language and speech processing specifically, and I've written papers in cognitive science, the journal, the conference. And so I actually think mental states are real, and we're actually trying to model it. So I like that quote, but I don't believe it. It's like a Malcolm Gladwell book, right? So I enjoy 100% of it, but 90% I disagree with. Okay, so, but it's all fun. Okay, so So that was the second thing, the God of the gaps. And linking to the God of the gaps argument, someone sent some feedback and said, like, oh, when you're talking about consciousness and God, you can very easily make category mistakes, okay? Then I went on Wikipedia and tried to figure out what a category mistake is. I'm not absolutely sure. There was an analogy of cricket and team stuff on Wikipedia. I got the analogy, but I still don't know what the category mistake is. But basically the argument, I think, was, and I got recommended a book, which I then read. I mean, I'm like almost done with the book. It's a very long book. Basically the argument is like consciousness and the mind. And if you define consciousness as basically maybe a very simplified definition of consciousness, of course I'm not an expert here, so I use consciousness very loosely, but if you define it as subjective experience, like I see a rose, or I listen to a Rise Against song and I start crying, right? My dad listens to that song and he's like, what's this noise, right? So that's subjective experience. That's a big part of consciousness, and then intentionality is another big part of consciousness. And the argument about category mistakes is like, materialism can't actually answer that question. So asking it to answer that question is already like a flawed thing to do, and that's kind of category mistake. So I read the book. Here's a quote from the book. I'm also not sure I entirely agree with this quote, but I do like it.
David Bentley Hart.
Okay, you can tell me about David Bentley Hart. I have no idea who this person is. I just read the whole book. I'll read the quote for. I'll read the quote for you. This is nice because you can now listen. Oh, it's nice for someone who likes speaking. Let me just take a sip. So the quote is this: the widely cherished expectation that neuroscience, or cognitive science, will one day discover an explanation of consciousness solely within the brain's electrochemical processes is no less enormous a category error than the expectation that physics will one day discover the reason for the existence of the material universe. Okay? Paraphrased, you can't asking neuroscientists and cognitive scientists to tell me something about consciousness is like asking a physicist who's really looking and studying the basics of life to tell me the meaning of life. A physicist can't do that, and I'm not sure I agree with it entirely, but it's a nice quote, right? Okay. Okay, I read this. Okay, and then the last thing, which is on the slide here, the last kind of feedback that I got from the previous talk, which I really appreciated, was from JP Harper, who said that I should really look up on Wikipedia. These words was that I should really.
We need to have a serious conversation about Wikipedia.
We can have big fights. In my department, I have massive fights with my colleagues who say we're not allowed to cite Wikipedia. Anyway, it is the source of all human knowledge. Okay, but well, no, the record of all. Okay, fine. I'll stay quiet. So JP recommended an article. That on Wikipedia about the evolutionary argument against naturalism, okay, which sounds quite big, but there's a lot of philosophers actually and looking at this. Before, I think there are more philosophers now looking at this evolutionary argument against naturalism. But the cool thing about that is because it's built on mind and on the mind, it looks a little bit at evolution. But then also the existence of God. And C.S. Lewis, he captured it very nicely for me. So I'm just going to read this for you. So pay attention. Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if you can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. So he's basically saying if you're a materialist, it's really difficult to trust your own thoughts, right? Unless I believe in God. So I reject material. I mean, he didn't say this. I'm saying this now. I reject materialism. I believe in God. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Okay, you can reread that. It's much nicer than what I said. Okay, so on the slide here, you can't see it because of load shedding. The slide says resources, and then it says some more really good Wikipedia articles on. Okay, and then the two articles, really, really good. Philosophy of mind, and then the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Okay, and then the next bullet says a book. It doesn't say a really good book. It just says a book. Okay, which is this David Bentley Hart. We can talk about that. The book's called The Experience of God, Being Consciousness Bliss, by David Bentley Hart. So the reason I'm saying this is not a good book is because I find it highly unenjoyable to read. So in contrast to Malcolm Gladwell, where I enjoy 100% of the book and agree with only 10%, in this case I agree with 70%. But I don't enjoy reading it. He's got a very provocative style of writing, which I think helps sell books. But I think Richard Dawkins has the same from the other side, like this extremely provocative thing, which I struggle to read. Okay, but I did read all of it. Well, almost all of it. I will finish it. But it's a really good book, and a lot of the arguments that I make, he makes in a lot more fleshed out way. I think there are things that he says that's wrong in the book, like that's full on wrong. So he talks about AI, and it's clear he's not a computer scientist. So he would say things about representation and mental states and so on, and which is factually incorrect. But the parts that I agree with is very similar to, I think, some of the arguments that I make. So to summarize, I read a lot after the TGIF talk, and I'm now very confused in the sense about how to make the argument that I made in ignorance before, and I'm still making in ignorance, to make it very succinct. I'm very confused because it's very clear many clever people who are really philosophers of mind have thought about this a lot more than I have. So I'm quite confused when I added these slides, I'm just like, oh, okay, this is now a little bit of a train smash. But I think I just want to boil it down again to, like, it's actually quite simple. And that is, I know, okay, naturalism versus atheism, or theism. Naturalism versus theism. If you just have those two options. I know that I am more than what is dictated by physics. Okay? I reject naturalism. Okay, so it's kind of like that. And I think intention is a big part of that. So maybe intention and subjective experience is a big part of things that naturalism, materialism, someone should explain the difference to me, physicalism can't answer. So I think it's actually a little bit simple, just after I got very confused. Okay, my last slide on here, you can't see it, but it's very, very relevant. Okay, so I asked ChatGPT. This is so relevant. This is on the slide. You won't believe me, but it says, "How would you address the load shedding crisis in South Africa?" Okay, and the response it gives me, this is on the slide, is too many requests in 1 hour. Try again later. Okay. Which I think is a cop-out answer. But anyway. Yeah, so I think that's it. I think that the only last thing I would say is the slides right at the beginning with the little pictures. Those pictures were all generated with DALL-E, which is actually a model that generates pictures for you. So you give it a text and it generates pictures. So there are a bunch of models apart from ChatGPT. So Copilot is one that people are using a ton for coding. My wife, she did political science, but now she does graphic design stuff, and graphic designers are using DALL-E to generate images for them. So Copilot for coding, ChatGPT for writing, and DALL-E for graphic stuff. So there's a bunch of these models. Okay, I'm done. I said I'll keep it all.